So just a welcome to all those who've just arrived. And I want to thank all of you for joining us. It's really good to have you here. It's a very important issue. I think I'll get started because I imagine the bulk of the people who are going to attend are here. I wanted to start off with our land acknowledgement and go there. We acknowledge we're hosted on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. We also recognize the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and the Inuit peoples. And I want to say that land acknowledgement is a good thing, but not enough. We also need real action on reconciliation. I want to say to everyone who's joined us this evening that the purpose of this meeting is to fill people in on what's happening with legislation, Bill 23, with the land swap that's happening in the Greenbelt. We want to hear from people who are fighting this. And to that end, Phil Pothen is here from Environmental Defense, who's one of the leaders in the actions pushing back against the government. And we wanted to hear from you, those who are very interested in this issue, what you want to see happen and to discuss ways we can all push back. I wanted to also, before we went any further, introduce our councillor, Paula Fletcher, who's been doing a lot of work around this Bill 23. Paula, I'm really glad you're able to drop in even for a few minutes. If you want to say hi to people and just say a bit about what you're doing on the bill, that would be wonderful.
Thank you, Peter. I really do. And I just want to say thank you for hosting this super important meeting on Bill 23. You can tell how interested people are by the number who are joining. I will be speaking to the committee Wednesday night at 5 o'clock. And I have been working quite a bit on rental replacement, which is a bylaw in the city of Toronto, where if you have 6 more units and a developer wishes to demolish, they have to replace those units. So it goes anywhere from 6 up to 250 that have been replaced. It's a real concern that that would be taken out of our ability to do that. And of course, the Greenbelt, which is your topic tonight, this is just a travesty. I'm on the Toronto Regional Conservation Authority, and we have spoken out about this because this bill and others simply strip the authority away from the conservation groups in ensuring that whatever's built and where it's built is not on a floodplain, is not going to have a terrible environmental impact. So this government is going full tilt on a whole number of fronts. And I just want to say thank you very much. I know there's a lot of people interested to hear what you have to say and what Phil has to say. And thank you very much for having me here for this minute. I'm looking forward to the meeting.
Thanks for taking the time to join us, Councillor. This is great. I want to say to everyone who's joined, and we're now well over 160, that I've been raising this issue in the legislature, put out a media release talking about how outrageous it is that the Premier is attacking the Greenbelt. Everyone knows that he's promised previously, after having his hand caught in the cookie jar twice, that he wouldn't touch it. And once again, a man who shows that you can't believe a word he says. So I've got here this evening Phil Pothen from Environmental Defense, who's going to be making a presentation. We'll have Phil talking for about 5 minutes. We'll have questions and commentary by participants. We're looking forward to your questions. You will see at the bottom of your screen the Q&A function, the question and answer function. We won't be using the raise hand feature or chat, but if you have a question, please plug it into the Q&A function, and I'll be monitoring those questions and passing them on to Phil after he's made his presentation. And I have to say, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our panelist. Phil Pothen is an environmental land use planning and administrative lawyer, and the Ontario Environment Program Manager with Environmental Defense, a well-known environmental organization in Canada. Using a combination of political advocacy, community legal education, and strategic litigation, Phil is helping lead the fight to protect Ontario's natural heritage and prevent runaway climate change by curbing sprawl and transforming existing car-dependent post-World War II developments across the province into denser, walkable, and transit-supported complete communities. It was Phil's analysis that initially lifted the lid on, quote, the big sprawl, the Ford government's attempts to use tweaks to obscure policy documents and a lot of behind the scenes arm twisting to railroad municipal governments into massive sprawl and mark the alternative path to meeting housing need that's become the basis of local stop sprawl movements across Ontario. I'm very happy to say that Phil is also an East End resident who lives just north of the Danforth near Main Square in Crescent Town. And with that, Phil, I turn it over to you for commentary.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you so much for inviting me here. I've been giving various webinars of this nature sort of all over the province, at least 3 nights a week, and it blew up over the past couple of weeks with this attack on the Greenbelt and the introduction of Bill 23. So these are, in a way, they're seen as 2 separate policies, but they're really, 2 of the 4 arms of this 4-armed monster of attacks on the environment. One of them is this direct carving out of chunks of land in the Greenbelt on the pretext of, quote unquote, replacing them with other pieces of land that would never have been developed anyway. Second, there is, of course, Bill 23, which is itself an omnibus bill that clumps together, vast, in many cases, unrelated pieces of legislation under the rhetorical cover of somehow trying to meet housing need. And then third, and these are lesser known things, there are regulatory changes which are being proposed now, which would expose something like 80% at minimum of current protected wetlands to destruction without any protection at all. And then fourthly, we have the government which has overturned 2 excellent official plans in Halton and Hamilton, which managed to meet those regions' entire housing demand in a cost-effective way without forcing more sprawl. And they ripped into those, took away the provisions to add more homes to existing neighborhoods, and forced sprawl on those municipalities. So these are 4 things that are happening all at once. And they all amount to an effort, while talking a lot about adding homes to existing neighborhoods, to push sprawl out into the countryside and to the extreme of leapfrogging the vast amounts of existing land that we have and carving out chunks of the Greenbelt, where no public interest exists in developing that land. The only interest that's served is that of the landowner, who very often, as you will see in media reports very soon, are closely connected to the government. So first of all, on the Greenbelt, I don't know how all of you came to be at this webinar, whether you're folks who were signed up by Peter and who are in the Danforth area. If that's the case, chances are that you came into the election knowing that you disagreed with Premier Ford about many things, and you're used to campaigning openly against stuff that the Premier is proposing. But this is the one instance where Tory voters, Liberal voters, and New Democrat voters all were voting for the same thing. It isn't something the Premier just said once back in 2018, which he did say. It's something that was repeated again and again as a sort of mantra, as a reason that the government should be forgiven for its shocking attacks on other environmental protectors. And that is, and I quote, and this was right before the election, "We will not consider any proposals to remove or develop any part of the Greenbelt." This was the government's loudest, clearest election promise in an election with hardly any commitments at all. Nobody who voted for the Tories could plausibly have thought that they were giving them a mandate to open up the Greenbelt. So Ontarians of every political stripe, for once, it's not just New Democrats, it's not just even New Democrats and Liberals, it's everybody has a right to be outraged and to demand that the government back down on its decision just months after the election to go back on its clearest promise. So the government is proposing to take 7,400 acres of land out of the Greenbelt, which is bad enough in itself. And the government hopes that you'll think that that's all this is about. But what this decision would really do, if it's allowed to go ahead, is pronounce a death sentence for the Greenbelt system as a whole. And that's because the Greenbelt isn't this bucket of rice. You know, it's not like a stockpile of rice. And as long as we put more rice in, we can take some rice out. What it is, it's a shield. It doesn't protect all of the land that needs to be protected forever in Ontario. It is focused on the most threatened subset of farmland and natural heritage in Ontario. And it doesn't include vast areas of farmland and natural heritage that need to be protected but aren't under threat. This land is included because it's needed as a shield to contain development and protect these particular pieces of land. So this, what it is meant to provide is certainty and permanence of this land within the Greenbelt, never, ever even possibly being anything other than farmland or natural heritage. Because that is the only thing that allows it to actually be farmed in a sustainable way rather than cash cropped. That's what allows farmers to maintain hedgerows and woodlots on their land and water bodies on their land and not try to plow them away. It's what allows them to feed and maintain their soils. It's just what allows for sustainable farming and not short-term cash cropping. So by signaling, and it's very clear that this is what the government is signaling, that it's open season for developers to start asking for their pet piece of land to be removed. They're painting a target on every plot of land in the Greenbelt and changing the way that the entire Greenbelt would be managed. So it's no longer Greenbelt, it's just land waiting for future development, and that destroys the Greenbelt system. The government has been trying to rationalize this attack on the Greenbelt as a measure to deliver more homes. But it's important to understand that this is completely disingenuous. When someone tells that to you, please do not go into some side argument about, oh, well, we don't really have a supply problem, we have a financialization problem. That's not the right argument. The clear argument is that there is such a vast supply of unused existing greenfield land already within the settlement boundaries of communities. I kid you not, 350 square kilometers of existing greenfield land are already within settlement area boundaries and sitting unused. And it would take decades upon decades to get through to that existing supply of greenfield land that's already within settlement area boundaries. Never mind the contested countryside, aka the white belt, that's beyond that. We would never need to touch the Greenbelt. This is about leapfrogging all those pieces of land and handpicking certain chunks of land that you will see belong to particular landowners that, from what I understand, what you'll see in the papers very soon, are closely connected with the government, and just effectively handing them millions, and in a couple cases, up to $3 or $4 billion worth of land value with the stroke of a pen. That's what we're talking about here. It's about enriching very particular people. Let's have a look. So it's important to understand also that this is, again, as I mentioned, embedded within this larger scheme. And the real centerpiece of that larger scheme is Bill 23, the so-called More Homes Built Faster Act. And here's the thing. I know that because we live in Toronto, the tendency is to fixate on the parts of the bill that are about to Toronto. But we've talked about this. We have a little bit of inside knowledge about what's going on the government side. They desperately want us to fixate on what will happen in Toronto as a result of this bill. They want us to believe that it's going to produce some big radical change to existing communities, that somehow there'll be so much construction going on that we won't be able to handle it. But the government has actually intentionally watered down provisions to add more homes to existing neighborhoods. They have delivered far less in terms of getting rid of exclusionary zoning than environmental organizations, housing supply advocates, housing affordability advocates have been asking for. They've actually refused to give us the changes that we want, such that taken together, all of the changes to so-called exclusionary zoning, which is a real problem, are so minor that they would add only about 50,000 homes across the entire province out of a total 1.5 million homes. The rules around major transit station areas, they want you to react against that and to think that there's going to be some flood of 90-story towers around every transit station. The bill does not deliver anything like that at all. All it does, the biggest change that we could see is that the city now has around 3 years to update its zoning after an official plan amendment around a major transit station area, and that would be reduced to a year. That's the biggest, most significant change that would potentially speed up housing. It's not going to be a big influx of new supply. I mean, there are lots of absurd, bad policy proposals in cities, such as getting rid of the Toronto Green Standard by eliminating site plan, like the big one that Councillor Fletcher pointed out. Very clearly their intention, that they've set up a regulatory framework to get rid of rental replacement, but they want us to, and rental replacement, please do talk about it, but do not spend your time talking about how this is going to ruin our city neighborhoods. That's what they want, because they want to make you look like a NIMBY and make them look like they are being bold and flipping over tables to deliver housing. Let's be clear, those are very minor measures. They won't deliver a lot of housing. The vast majority of the bill, the biggest thrust of the bill, and the most impactful part of the bill will be to attack conservation authorities, woodlands, provincially significant wetlands, and to enable the destruction of huge amounts of habitat. If this bill goes ahead, I've heard from reliable sources, often within conservation authorities, who are not really at liberty to take a public stance on these issues, that we could see the biggest loss of biodiversity in Ontario that we've seen in half a century at least. A rapid drop in biodiversity. We're talking about at least 80% of wetlands that are currently protected becoming fair game for filling in. It would be a catastrophe. So government will try to tell you, and their message track is that the changes to conservation authorities are only streamlining it or reducing them to their core mandate. But this is nonsense. What they've done is they're pulling the goalie when it comes to protecting wetlands altogether. Municipalities, while they have bylaws, and Toronto has better bylaws than many others, they largely leave it up to conservation authorities to take the lead in refusing permits for development that would cause flooding or landslides. And they rely on the expertise of conservation authorities, even within their own jurisdiction, to decide what they need to do. The government's bill would remove the power of conservation authorities to say no to development that will cause flooding and landslides themselves. And it's not just about reducing them to their core mandate, they're taking away that core mandate. And then secondly, and this is the appalling thing beyond that, it's not just about saying now they're going to advise municipalities and they'll get all the information and the municipality will make the decision. No, the government is actually gagging conservation authorities by prohibiting them from entering into agreements with municipalities so that they would do the work and give the information to councils to make those decisions. There's just nobody who's going to be in a position to do that work. There's going to be no authority with both the expertise and the authority to stop flooding and landslides. And this is going to mean that the main thing that has kept Ontario from being like Alberta or Manitoba or, heaven forbid, Florida, where large amounts of property are destroyed by so-called natural disasters all the time. But those are really planning disasters, not natural disasters. They come from putting development in places where it doesn't go. They come from paving places where they'll cause flooding elsewhere. And this is a recipe for Pickering Council to essentially pave half of Pickering without care to whether it will flood Ajax. It's going to mean a big, dangerous change. And so the government will say, well, all of this may be true. Then they'll try to say, we need to do this because we're in a housing supply crisis. The wrong answer on that is to say, oh, we don't have a housing supply crisis and it's about financialization. That's the thought. You may think that. It's not the right message here. The real message is, and this is very key, the government's attack on regional planning, its push towards sprawl, is going to provide less housing, not more overall. And that's because the big constraint on housing supply these days is not a lack of land. It's a lack of construction resources that's highly constrained and that's being squandered on very resource intensive forms of development. And I don't mean really high rises. What I'm really thinking of is that in 1975, the average size of a single detached home in Canada was just over 1,000 square feet. Today in Mississauga, the average size of a new single detached home is over 3,900 square feet. So we have a huge amount of construction going ahead, but being squandered on fewer resource-intensive homes for a fewer number of people and leaving other people without the housing they need. Pushing housing into the suburbs, into the, not beyond the suburbs, into the exurbs, into farmland and natural heritage, means that resources will have to get squandered on creating brand new infrastructure, brand new roads, and the type of housing there that's going to get built there. We know this because the government has telegraphed this by lowering density house targets for greenfield development. It's going to be those larger, more resource-intensive homes. So that means that there will be less housing in the places where people actually want to live, and in the places where housing is desperately needed, places like Toronto-Danforth, like Scarborough, like Etobicoke, like North York, where there are vastly more people who want to live there than there are homes. Resources are going to be diverted away from that to building McMansions in the Greenbelt. That means less housing, not more. So unless the flaws in this bill are addressed, this is going to further the destruction of critical nature areas at a time when the climate crisis requires those areas more than ever. But it's also going to worsen our slump towards the climate crisis. Because the only way for Ontario to meet its CO2 emissions reduction targets is for us to transform our existing suburbs. Now, the biggest mistake of the past generation, those low density car dependent suburbs, they've got to be densified up to around 90 to 100 people per hectare and transformed into complete walkable communities. And in order to accomplish that, we need those extra homes and workplaces that the government wants to squander on more sprawl. We need them within those existing communities to bring the existing suburbs up to densities that will support transit. Because we've got to get them up to a situation where you have enough concentration of people so you can actually walk to everything you need or take transit to everything you need. It's cost effective to make transit. So this is really tossing climate obligations in the trash. It's tossing any hope of meeting housing demand in existing neighborhoods in the trash. This is junking all of the commitments that the government needs to make in order to look after Ontarians, essentially to look after a few select donors instead.
So Phil, I'm going to wrap you up there, the questions have been coming in very steadily. I want to say to people who are watching this evening that if you have a question for Phil or myself, and Paula, if you're able to stay, if you have questions for Paula, please put them in the Q&A and we'll be bringing them up for response. Phil, I'm going to start with the first one to you. I'm not familiar with the law on this. Is it possible to apply for personhood for the Greenbelt land? It's been done to protect bodies of water as it's considered alive. Land is as alive as water. Is this something that could be considered?
I mean, it might be considered in a theoretical way, but it's certainly not among the practical solutions that would allow us to defeat this attack on the Greenbelt. There are a lot of simpler, lower hanging fruit approaches that would protect the Greenbelt than that. Not to say it's a bad idea, but it's not one of the easiest options on the table.
Okay, thank you. I'll go to the next. I spoke to an economist who suggested that the backlash bill one, sorry, too many bills in my life, my friends, that the backlash Bill 23 is experiencing is purely ideological. What do you say to that?
I'm going to paraphrase a quote, which I can't remember precisely, but that people who think that they are acting on common sense and are ideological are 9 times out of 10 acting on an ideology of their own that they simply don't recognize. I mean, there is no such thing as ideological versus non-ideological decisions. This is a practical necessity. We need this farmland in order to feed ourselves. We need this land in order to save species from extirpation. Like, there are species that will be wiped out if we destroy the Greenbelt and if we destroy these wetlands. If we pass this legislation, those are facts. Those are, rational conclusions to draw about the legislation. Is it ideological to say that we shouldn't drive species to extinction or extirpation? Maybe. Is it ideological to say that we should be able to feed ourselves in the next, in 30 years from now? Maybe you can call it ideological, but it's ultimately good policy. And if whoever said that to you thinks it's not good policy, then it falls on them to make a case why we should allow species to be driven to extinction and why we don't need to feed ourselves. I don't know what they're getting on with.
Okay. And next question is, what is inclusionary zoning? Because I think you and I are familiar with it, but an awful lot of people aren't.
So there are two things that often get conflated with one another. There's something called exclusionary zoning. Exclusionary zoning is zoning that restricts the vast majority of existing land within Toronto and most existing neighborhoods to the most environmentally harmful, most expensive, and least affordable type of housing, which is low-rise, single, detached housing. And so a lot of us are talking about getting rid of exclusionary zoning and replacing it with rules that will cause bungalow lots to be flipped into, walk-up apartments like we see on the beach. For example, there are a lot of those. That's why it's not entirely a rich neighborhood, and townhomes, lower cost forms of housing. But that's separate. Inclusionary zoning is a particular policy, a particular tactic that is used to try and get some lower cost or affordable housing built by sort of piggybacking on demand for housing in the most high demand areas. So the idea behind it is that it's certain locations where there's very high demand. The demand is so high that there's room, you can actually charge a much higher margin for the market housing and use some of those margins from the market housing to actually keep other units permanently affordable. So essentially you get like rich people essentially who are buying expensive units to pay more in order so that some of their some of the money they pay can be put towards creating low-cost, permanently or long-term affordable units. This is a policy that could generate some affordable housing in Toronto, in particularly like highly sought-after areas. It depends on, there's something called penciling. So basically, there has to be enough demand in that area so that you can charge enough in excess of what it costs to build that unit to get money to pay for those existing homes. So what the government has done is, rather than letting municipalities assess for themselves, what it will take, like how much affordable housing you can require in order to, how much affordable housing you can require without stopping the construction from going ahead, they've just imposed, I think it's a 5% cap on the proportion of units that can be required to be affordable. And then they've done something which actually is really irrelevant to the financial viability of these projects. And it is purely a giveaway for the builders of those projects. And that is that they would shorten the period when those land properties are required to be affordable to 25 years rather than require permanent affordability. So when it comes to reducing the share of housing that would have to be affordable, there might be some case to be made that because of what's going on, with tightening interest rates, et cetera, that if the required percentage of affordable housing was too high, they wouldn't be able to get financing and they wouldn't be able to build the project at all. And then we'd end up with less housing. But that certainly doesn't apply to the affordability period, because, especially, 25 years out, you're beyond the period usually where you'd be getting square on the project. That's just pure profit at that point. It's not affecting the viability of the project ever being built. So that's a pure giveaway. And I think capping the percentage of affordability at 5% by legislation is using the cover of our current circumstances where interest rates are rising to establish a permanent cap. Like, this is a legislated cap. It's not a floating cap that's tied to interest rates or anything like that. They're using it a bit as a pretext, I think, to carve down that inclusionary zoning.
Phil, thank you for that. I'm going to go on to the next question. The person who posted it wrote quite extensively, but I'm going to take the critical part at the end. We need to focus on the protection of agricultural land. As I understand, the land that is being considered is mainly the ag lands. Is this part of the response and are you engaging the agricultural interest groups? Just before I turn it over to you, Phil, when we raised the question in the House yesterday, it was exactly on this, on the agricultural lands, and asking the Premier where we're supposed to get the food to feed ourselves with if he was paving over all of our potential farmland. I understand the Ontario Federation of Agriculture has also come out and said that this attack on the Greenbelt is an attack on farming. That's very significant. The Ontario Federation of Agriculture is pretty well respected and fairly powerful in rural Ontario. And they actually were central in turning back the Premier the last time he attacked the Greenbelt. So, Phil, that's what I know from my end. What's your comment on this? Is Environmental Defense working with agricultural interest groups?
We've kind of been working hand in glove, not because they're in the tank for us or anything, but because their interests really are aligned. What it comes down to is, even if we were strictly interested in the habitat components, it is often fatal to the species that live in a patch of forest or a river or a wetland when the land around it gets converted from farmland to asphalt, to driveways, to backyards. Species can't survive there anymore. So actually, agriculture is the best neighbor that we could have by and large for nature. And so this means that we have been oftentimes working in parallel, commissioning almost identical ads, running at the same time, calling for exactly the same policies. And I fully expect that we will be fully aligned this time. We meet quite regularly. We've got a great relationship.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another question here. Questions have been raised about how Greenbelt lands have been purchased by investment development firms when under the old laws, there was no chance of being able to develop them. Can there be inquests? How much is Ford profiting from these deals? I know, Phil, you want to talk to this, but I'd like to comment on this as well. I don't think anyone has made any credible allegation that Doug Ford is personally profiting from these deals with money flowing into his pockets. That being said, it is being pointed out that a number of these landowners who are going to make fabulous wealth over this change in the law have been very generous donators to the Conservative Party of Ontario. And so, although nothing illegal is currently alleged, I can say very clearly that something really smelly is going on. And the writer of this question notes that land was purchased when it was outside of the development process. And that's absolutely the case, something that we noted today in question period. Can there be an inquest? I don't think there'll be one under the Ford government, but it's always possible after the Ford government is defeated to actually hold an inquest and see what went on here. Phil, I've rattled on. What commentary do you have on it?
I agree with everything that Peter said about this. I think one of the most interesting examples we see here. So first of all, it's very hard to overstate, the extreme unearned windfall that is going to these landowners simply because Minister Clark, put a signature on a document. Whatever money that these folks spent on lobbyists was the best money that anyone could ever spend. And we've done some assessments where it looks like the land value for certain plots of land will go from, maybe $20-30 million, which is nothing to sneeze at, to something like $4 billion, as a result of this. And one of the more interesting stories is the Duffins Rouge Agricultural Reserve, which was originally put off limits for development and subjected to an easement preventing non-agricultural development that was in favor of, I believe, the Pickering. And so the owner, de Gasperis, went and lobbied Pickering to simply unilaterally waive this easement. And just to be clear, an easement is property. An easement is a property right that belonged to Pickering. So he lobbied them to just give away this easement to him, to the Gasperis, with magic cash value. So then the government of the day responded at the provincial level by legislating away that easement and replacing it with an easement to the provincial government. So in order to do the development that Doug Ford is proposing now on the Duffins Rouge agricultural land, there would need to be a massive giveaway of taxpayer property, this easement that is owned by the provincial government to the Gasperis. This is not just freeing up land, loosening regulations. This is giving away a vast monetary value to property to a politically connected family. It's really extraordinary. The government hasn't announced the waiver or the any legislative change to deliver that. But if they're proposing that this is going to be delivered within the next 3 years, development starting on that patch of land, that will entail a huge giveaway of taxpayer property. And there is something that might become the subject of an inquiry.
Phil, thank you. I've got another one here. Could you please define the parameters of green field versus green belt? Thank you.
Sure. So greenfield land is essentially any land that isn't built on already in one way or another. So you talk about brown fields are old industrial land that's contaminated. It's open for development now. Then there's infill, that's areas that are already built on and being used for something, where you can add homes, either within the existing footprint by adding on another story, or you could add units just by splitting up existing floor space. Greenfield is farmland and natural heritage land that would be built on. So there's a vast area of greenfield that is between the existing built up area and the Greenbelt. Around half of that is already within settlement areas. So municipalities in previous years under the Liberals, they already made this extreme land grab, which the Liberals approved at the time, that brought vast swaths of land in, and they brought in so much land that they didn't come close to using it up. They used up a tiny fraction of it between 2001 and 2019. That is designated greenfield area, already within the settlement area boundary, already planned development. Beyond that, there's another piece of greenfield, which we call the contested countryside, and which developers like to call the white belt because it doesn't sound like it's green. That's actually greenfield too. That's land that's off limits for development now, but conceivably could be open for development in the future. And beyond that, and only beyond that, do you get to the green belt. And the green belt is land that is supposed to be forever, perpetually, never touched by development. And it's that the government is trying to tear open now, skipping over all those other pieces of land.
Okay, Phil, the questions are coming in very strongly. I want to thank everyone who's posted. We're trying to get to as many as we can. Phil, I would like right now to have you, and I'm going to jump in on this as well, talk about what people can do to fight back, because I think most of those who are attending this evening understand that what's happening is wrong. They want to do something about it. They want a sense of how to take it on. So, Phil, if you wouldn't mind starting, it would be good for people to hear from you, and I would like to throw in a few comments myself. Phil.
All right. So this four-pronged attack on Ontario's environment is appalling. And it can seem like it's hard to push back. It's something that's going to happen anyway. But that's what people thought about the attack on the teachers. And this is not a government that can be pressured to do the right thing or convinced to do the right thing through gentle reasoning. It is a government that can be terrified into doing the right thing because they know it's going to be politically toxic for them. And so this is why it is key to make as loud a noise as you can. I'd ask you, first of all, to Google hands off the Greenbelt. And what we have there is a list of protests. I think there must be something like 20 protests that are happening in different locations over the next few days, not just here in Toronto, but all across Ontario. I encourage you to find one nearby and show up. Because I know that you're in Toronto-Danforth, let me say, we are going to be in committee tomorrow and day after tomorrow. And we are going to be going to talk. We'd like to ask if you're experienced with this sort of thing, if you can show up during the day outside the entrance to the Legislative Assembly tomorrow and protest, bring some signs, voice your support for deputants like Councillor Fletcher and I, who will be speaking against Bill 23, that would be helpful. If you go to the Environmental Defense website, there is also an email action where you will be able, and this is very important, that the government just hear a torrent of comment direct from citizens asking them not to go ahead with this, presenting it as a betrayal. I know that a lot of you will be in Toronto-Danforth, but I think that this is technically open to other people. If you are a Tory voter, if you are a Tory volunteer, especially if you are a member of a PC Riding Association, you are the most influential person right now. We need you to tear your MPP or your candidate's ears off and say, you're going to walk away if they go ahead with this bill and with this Greenbelt takeout. Because particularly with the Greenbelt takeout, if you're a PC voter, this is something where you've lied to. They got your vote under false pretenses this time around. There is no way they can claim a mandate. And so we're asking you to write letters to the committee, make a submission to the committee, and please. Here's the thing: what you say in the public square and to the government is every bit as important as how much you say it, because the government wants you to say, look, these are the things. We made a list of things that we know the government wants you to say. Number one, the government wants you to say we don't have a housing supply crisis, that this is all about financialization, and really we don't need more homes. They want you to say that because then they will just dunk on you and say that they just don't want to deliver housing. Number two, they want you to say, well, market supply doesn't matter at all. We don't need housing. We need to build. We need a public builder. We need vast amounts of public housing, but that doesn't change the need that we also need other housing. The government wants you to say, this is going to destroy my existing low-rise neighborhood. I don't want tall buildings near me. The government is going to cram too many people. They want you to use terms like stack them and rack them and all this kind of stuff, because they want people to believe that that's what they're doing, that the thrust of this bill is adding homes to existing housing. Don't say any of that. Say this bill will produce less housing in existing neighborhoods, more housing in sprawl. Say that this bill is this plan is a plan to pave and fill in wetlands, and that the main motivation of the government is to enrich particular landowners that are connected to the government, and that they are willfully refusing to take the measures that would create more housing, simply because they're actually just interested in benefiting those people. So, and then of course, there's actually the substantive environmental concerns. The key talking point is this will produce less housing in the places where it's needed and squander resources on sprawl.
Phil, thank you for that. I want to comment a bit about what people can do. I'm going to note there was a question about what the timeline is. There are going to be some hearings over this week and I think next week. But my expectation is the government wants to wrap this bill up very early in December. They are going to be pushing very hard. There are a few things I want to say. First is that Ford has been beaten on the Greenbelt before. He's been beaten twice, and I think that there's every opportunity to beat him a third time. People should know that the Ontario Federation of Agriculture has come out and said this is a bad move. We in the NDP are trying to talk to others to get the word out. I would say that if you're in a position to sign a petition or even draft a petition, and if you want to send me an email, look up Peter Tabuns MPP, you'll find my email address. We'd help you draft a petition if you want to do one in your own neighborhood. I would say you could phone the Premier. I just Googled Doug Ford, Premier of Ontario, and you'll see his office number. Now, I'm going to tell you all right now, Doug is not going to pick up that phone, but they do have a lot of staff standing by, and they measure what's going on in the wider public by the number of calls and emails that they have coming in. If you're in a position to make those phone calls, the person who answers the phone is not a high up decision maker. They're doing clerical work, so there's no point in yelling at them. But there's a very good point in talking to them and saying, we want the Premier to know he's got to stop this. They are going to be making these decisions not based on the welfare of Ontario. They're not concerned about whether or not the province will be in good shape. Apparently, they don't care whether or not people's homes will be flooded. They do care if they're in trouble politically, if they see their numbers dropping. And having you phone the Premier's office is one way of conveying that message that you are in trouble, that you're making a mistake, and that you have to back off. And I'd also like to suggest that if you're part of a public group, if you're in a tenants association, a homeowners group, a parent-student council at a school, a church, get a resolution passed and send a letter to the Premier saying, we represent 40 people who are in our neighborhood, and we think that you have to back off on this. It's not legitimate. You're just helping your friends make a fortune. The more letters that come in like that, the better. And frankly, the other thing you might do is send those letters to the Toronto Star and to the Beach Metro News. And the more evidence there is that the public is appalled and angry at this, the more impact that's going to have on public opinion and, in the end, on that particular government, the Ford government. I'm going to go back to another question here. What about what the TRCA discovered is going on in the Duffins Creek wetland right now? How can whomever has already tilled the wetland that's supposed to be protected be allowed to get away with this crime? Phil, between the two of us, you're the lawyer, so it's all yours, sir.
So first of all, my feeling is that the developer and the landowner in that case wants us to think that that wetland is permanently destroyed. The truth is, a wetland is permanently destroyed when it's filled in, when the soil has been removed, when it's paved. This has been extremely destructive on the wetland. It has probably killed a lot of the existing wildlife there, but the seed bank is still present. It's still a regenerable wetland, so it's not a lost cause now. It will take restoration and time to bring it back to what it was. So that's the first point. The second point, what can we do? The most important thing we can do is ensure that they don't get their way as a result of this. We can ensure that this land is never open for development. We can defeat this bill. They want us to think that it's worthless land. We can continue to protect it as we've done before. It isn't clear what the Conservation Authority feels able to do from a technical point of view and from a political point of view, given that the authority itself is so much under pressure. So I will leave that particular point to the Conservation Authority. The claim that was made by the landowner is that, oh, this was just a farmer going about his business as normal. It's very unlikely that that was what was happening. So I think the main thing, the thing that will annoy them and hurt the most, is to keep pushing to protect that wetland, to not accept that it's gone, and to stop it from ever turning into a warehouse or a subdivision ever in the future.
Okay, thank you. Boy, all of you out there who are writing questions, thank you. I've got one here. I'm attending from Ottawa. Welcome. This bill is affecting us hugely as well. The number of allowable large homes is way higher than what is needed. Intensification, as you say, is what we need. Our outgoing city council analyzed the effect, and it boils down to taxpayers being overburdened hugely by requirements for new infrastructure. Can you tell us how we can work with people in Toronto? Phil, your organization spans the province. What do you advise here?
Well, listen, first of all, I mean, the most important thing we can do, if you want to actually cooperate with us, go to our website, environmentaldefense.ca, and you'll be able to find me there. Please shoot me an email. We're working with groups like Horizon Ottawa, Better Ottawa. There are local organizations who have been great partners there. We put out a model platform in Ottawa to promote densification. But the most effective thing you can do on the ground in Ottawa in order to prevent this sprawl is sap away all the demand for that sprawl. And the same thing goes for Toronto. The Greenbelt takeouts are unique because the government is trying to force them to be used right away or not at all. But the vast push towards sprawl onto wetlands in Bill 23, it won't actually happen if Toronto does its part and approves vast numbers of homes within Toronto. In particular, we're calling on Toronto to approve 1.4 million homes within the existing area. And so what you want to look at is that total figure in Ottawa. What's the total number of homes that have been assigned to Ottawa? And tell your councillor that you want that entire number of homes approved within the existing settlement boundary for Toronto. So they should have enough as of right homes to sap that entire demand, so that they've built all those out first before any of that greenfield land can be developed. What it boils down to is that each home that your city creates in excess of what the province has assigned to it in existing neighborhoods is a piece of farmland and natural heritage that's being protected and not getting paved. So the best thing you can do, become a booster for more homes in your neighborhood.
Phil, thank you for that. I'm going to go on to a comment and then we'll take another question. And I'll just note, it's just about 8 o'clock now. We'll be wrapping up within 10 minutes. We'll take a few more questions. And then Phil, I imagine you have a few comments you'd like to make before we finalize, and so would I. So why hasn't there been a complete explanation given tonight, put on the front page of the Star newspaper? We need the public to rise up and show the Ford that this is not acceptable and won't happen. We need thousands to rise up and protest. And next question. The case is clearly compelling. How can we work together to overturn this legislation? Phil, did you have any other ways that you'd want to suggest to people on how to overturn this legislation?
Yeah, so I would, again, if you please go to the Environmental Defense website and register as a supporter, because you will get that email that just allows you to click and populate an email to your MPP, who in the case would be Peter, but also to the minister and to the premier to really up that pressure. It's a very low-hanging fruit. It will then give you an option. Soon we'll have an option so that you can call the minister, call the premier, and that will be pre-populated. It'll be a click-to-call set up, so you can click it and you'll easily be able to talk to them. You don't need to be digging up a number. So please do that. And then please show up to those protests at Hands Off the Greenbelt. If you just Google Hands Off the Greenbelt, show up there. I mean, ultimately it's activism, and a lot of you have been doing that for years. We got to keep doing that. We know it works on this government, so we got to make it happen.
Okay, I have another note here. This is from Millie. Open letters were recently sent to the federal government to request intervention on Ontario's plans to ramp up gas-fired electricity. Could a similar formal request be made by the federal government to intervene, possibly invoking an act such as CEPA, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, in its current form? CEPA is currently in the process of being overhauled. Can we take action in these ways to have the federal government intervene?
So, I mean, first of all, we are in a more difficult circumstance with this than we would be with the 413 or with gas plants, because land use planning and municipal affairs are kind of more squarely within the jurisdiction of the provincial government. But I've actually been working with a federal MP today trying to explore these options. And there are a couple tools that could be used. One of them is what is called a supportive policies agreement. So we're in an interesting circumstance now where the government is dependent on the New Democrats to survive, and that means there's some leverage there. And one of the things that Environmental Defense, alongside the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, we've both asked is that as a condition of capital funding for major transit projects, for major sewer projects, for major infrastructure in general, the federal government start requiring municipalities to enter into supportive policy agreements that require those municipalities to build their housing in existing neighborhoods. So that the logic behind it is if you're going to invest in public transit, it shouldn't be a transit line that just runs through single detached neighborhoods. That value should be maximized. So as part of that deal, the municipality should have to upzone those neighborhoods to provide, a lot of homes in those neighborhoods. And so by doing that, the federal government can leverage its investment to force the densification that the provincial government, despite all of its talk, is trying to stop. And in particular, it can force or it can create incentives for for the municipal governments to add more homes in existing neighborhoods than the government is providing for or forcing on municipalities. And so the federal government can use its spending power to leverage some of the changes that the provincial government is unwilling to do. And the other piece of this is that we're asking the federal government to refuse outright any funding to new infrastructure, new limited access highways, anything outside of existing settlement boundaries. So basically, that's just a non-starter for federal funding.
Okay. And we're running low. I've got one last question here. What about insurance companies as potential allies? They have a ton of money and should be concerned about flooding claims as a result of this attack on the Greenbelt. Phil, do you see?
Yeah, you're hitting all the buttons that I've been trying to press. I've just been talking with a very, I won't give their name, but a very influential, long-time insurance industry lobbyist, trying to find the right people to partner with there. The difficulty that we have in Ontario is that there are some things that the insurance industry wants to do that the provincial government has been proposing to do, particularly around auto insurance and things along these lines. So the insurance industry is actually terrified of these changes to Conservation Authorities Act. They do believe it will cause flooding, huge liabilities, but they know that this is a very transactional government, and that if they are too noisy about this, they may lose the changes that they want to auto insurance. And so the particular insurance components of the insurance industry that are influential, and it's very down in the weeds, are these insurers called reinsurers. These are basically the insurance companies that insure the insurance companies. And those companies are not exposed to auto insurance in the same way. And so we're reaching out to them to see if they can use their influence with the provincial government, because they don't have the risk attached to speaking out.
Okay, thank you for that. I think we're going to wrap up. I just wanted to say a few things. First off, this issue is very much alive in the legislature. I'm head of the official opposition. We're going after the government pretty steadily on this. They really don't have any credible defense. It's very clear to everyone that this attack on the Greenbelt is being done as a favor to Doug Ford's friends, who will make an awful lot of money on this. I would say that the Bill 23, its failure to actually produce affordable housing, its attack on tenants and affordable rental units in Toronto is pretty clear. And its attack on the conservation authorities is also something that is an example of a government that has no moral compass whatsoever. This story is not over. I'm glad people attended tonight. I hope you will take action as we've recommended. I want to thank Phil for taking the time to come and speak this evening. And I want to thank my staff for pulling this all together. And I want to thank all of you who've joined. And with that, Phil, I'm going to turn it back to you for the last word on this whole issue of Bill 23, sprawl, and the attack on the Greenbelt.
Just prior to starting this full-fledged webinar, we had a brief talk, and one of the key things that you could do tomorrow is watch the testimony at the Legislative Assembly. And I don't know if it's Elaine or Rob, if one of you could share the link that you could use to view that. If you are at all involved in social media, if you have an account, what we'd love you to do is watch for environmental NGOs, for organizations that are criticizing Bill 23 in the legislature tomorrow, and amplify the comments they make, and particularly amplify the comments about sprawl, about there not being enough housing in existing neighborhoods. Do not engage with this stuff about too much density from certain NIMBY residents associations, and where possible, we'll be putting out. If you follow my Twitter account at Pothen or at EnviroDefense, you may also follow, but at Pothen is probably the best one. You'll get talking points that respond to some of the arguments that the government side handpicked witnesses will be making. So if you can use your voice to really, create a storm of scorn towards some of those arguments, that would be very helpful tomorrow. So I hopefully Elaine or someone can share the link, or you can send it as part of the follow-up to this webinar.
Okay.
Thanks, folks.
Phil, thank you very much. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. I hope you have a good evening, and I hope you take time to actually intervene. Phone calls, petitions, as Phil has said, follow the hearings themselves, and talk to your neighbors and friends about how this has to be resisted. Thanks again, everyone. Have a good night.